I remember the exact moment I learned that my mother decided things for me, though I didn't call it that at the time. I was 8. We were at the grocery store. There was a moment near the produce section where my father picked up two types of tomatoes, the expensive ones, the heirloom kind, and the ordinary ones. He asked my mother which she preferred, and I remember watching her face. Not her saying anything immediately, but just the pause. The way her eyes moved between the two packages, the way she took them both from his hands without speaking. She held the heirloom tomato up to the light coming through the store windows. I remember it was late afternoon, and the tomato glowed a little in that light. Orange-red, beautiful in an obvious way. She turned it over in her hands. Then she set it back on the pile. The ordinary one, pale, waxy, the kind that never tastes like much of anything, she held for just a moment longer. When my father reached to pick the heirloom box back up, my mother set her hand on his wrist. Not roughly, not in a way that would draw attention, just there, a weight. And he stopped reaching. His hand stayed in the air for a moment, then fell. He didn't argue. He just let it happen. That's not the story I'm here to confess, but it's where I learned something about her, about how decisions worked in our house, about the quiet way authority moves through a family, not through volume, but through the shape of a silence, through the implication that some choices belong to certain people and other people simply accept those choices, through the understanding that resistance itself is a kind of violence and compliance is a kind of peace. I should be clearer about who my mother was. Is. She's still alive, which is its own kind of complication. She was a woman who made sense. That's the thing that matters most. She was tall, organized, had opinions about how things should be done, and most importantly, she was usually right. Not always. I can think of specific moments where she was demonstrably wrong, but enough of the time that it didn't matter. People deferred to her. My father's colleagues deferred to her. Teachers deferred to her at parent-teacher conferences. And I deferred to her, which seemed like the natural order. Like that was what children did. They learned early that someone in the house knew better, and they aligned with that knowing. They learned that the world was divided into people who understood how things worked and people who didn't. My mother was not unkind. This is important. I need to say this clearly because the way people tell stories about their parents, there's often this convenient villain hidden in there somewhere. A moment you can point to and say, that's when I knew. That's the crack in the foundation. But my mother was not that kind of villain. She was the kind of person who remembered my teachers' names. Not just their last names, but something personal. That my 5th grade teacher had mentioned her daughter was applying to colleges, or that my math teacher had said he was training for a marathon. My mother would remember these things and ask about them months later, and teachers would light up. They would say, "Your mother is wonderful." And she was. She was genuinely interested in the mechanisms of the world, in how things worked, in people's motivations and limitations. She asked clarifying questions. When something confusing happened, my mother broke it down into manageable pieces. She looked for the logic underneath the emotion. She believed that most problems, if examined carefully enough, could be solved. Or if they couldn't be solved, they could at least be managed. She was capable of making hard choices sound reasonable. My sister Caroline was 3 years younger than me. When I was 8 and learned about the tomatoes, Caroline was 5. She was a strange child, anxious, sensitive, prone to emotional intensity that seemed to come from nowhere and had no apparent trigger. Where I was cautious and quiet, able to sit alone for hours and be perfectly content, Caroline moved through the world like she was constantly surprised by how much it could hurt. She would cry at commercials, actual tears. I remember one time a commercial for life insurance came on, just a man talking about planning for his family's future, and Caroline was devastated. She couldn't explain why. She just kept saying, "Something bad is going to happen." She would worry about things that hadn't happened yet, things that were unlikely to happen. She became convinced that people didn't like her based on the smallest social misstep. If a friend didn't text back for an hour, she was certain the friendship was over. My parents handled this differently. My father tried to reassure her. He would sit with her on the couch, sometimes for an hour or more, and explain logic, that people were inherently good, that her fears were unfounded, that statistically speaking, the things she worried about almost never happened, that she would be okay. He believed in the power of reassurance. He believed that enough love and enough certainty from the people who knew her could counteract whatever was happening in her brain. My mother observed. She watched Caroline work herself into states over small things and took mental notes. She would watch my father sitting with Caroline, being patient, being endlessly reassuring, and I could see her thinking. I could see the calculation happening. Sometimes, when my father was being particularly gentle about it, when he was really leaning into the reassurance, my mother would catch my eye from across the room with a look that suggested patience was not infinite, that there was a limit to how much energy could be spent on this particular problem. "She'll have to learn that the world won't accommodate her," my mother said once, when Caroline was having trouble at school because she was too shy to raise her hand, too afraid of being wrong to participate. "Coddling won't help her. If anything, it will make things worse. She'll never develop the resilience she needs." I don't think my mother disliked Caroline. I don't think it was that simple. I think my mother looked at my sister and saw a certain kind of fragility that she fundamentally did not trust. She did not trust it, and she wanted it fixed, the way you might want to fix a mechanical problem. Once you identify the issue, you repair it. You don't accommodate it. You don't build your entire life around it. Our house was functional. That's what I need you to understand. We were not a tragic family. We were not poor. We were not dysfunctional in the loud, obvious ways that make people recognize dysfunction. We were not screaming. We were not violent. My father had a stable job in finance. My mother ran a small accounting business from home. We ate dinner together, usually around 6:30. We went on vacations, a week in Maine every summer, skiing for 4 days in winter. We were the kind of family that outsiders would look at and think, well, that works, that functions, that has its act together. But the currency of our family was not chaos averted. It was stability maintained. And my mother was very good at maintaining it. She maintained it the way someone might maintain a lawn, with careful attention and the removal of anything that threatened the appearance of health. When I was 16, my sister was 13. By then, something had shifted in her. The ambient anxiety had become more sophisticated. It had developed texture and specificity. She had developed what I now understand were probably depressive episodes, though we didn't have words for it then. We had words like moody and ungrateful and dramatic, but not the words we actually needed. She would sleep 14 hours on a Saturday, and my mother would comment on it, not harshly, but noting it, the way you might note an irregularity. She would refuse to go to birthday parties, and my father would try to convince her, and she would just sit in her room with the door closed. She started cutting classes. Not many, just enough that the school called. My mother took that call. She listened, and then she said something like, "We'll address it at home," and she hung up. When she told us about it, she mentioned it in the context of how embarrassing it was, how it reflected on the family. I remember one evening, I was sitting in the kitchen doing homework, and my mother came home from some event. She looked tired. She set down her purse slowly, like it was heavier than usual. She made tea. She always made tea when she needed to think, and without preamble, she said, "I'm concerned about your sister." Not "I'm worried," concerned. The word choice mattered in our house. Worried suggested emotion, panic, instability. Concerned suggested thought, observation, analysis. "What's wrong with her?" I asked. "Nothing is wrong," my mother said, and she emphasized the word with her hands, drawing quotes in the air. "But she's not equipped for a normal life the way you are. She doesn't have the resilience, and I'm trying to figure out what that means for our family." I remember that sentence. I remember how it sounded. It sounded like she was thinking out loud. It sounded like she was including me in something, like I was intelligent enough to consider difficult things, like I was on her side, the side of the people who understood how the world actually worked. "What do you mean, what it means for our family?" I asked. My mother didn't answer immediately. She made her tea carefully, watching the water darken. She used a particular bag, a special brand she ordered, and she would let it steep for exactly 3 minutes. She was thinking. And I waited, because that's what you did in our house. You waited for the person who thought things through to arrive at their thoughts. You didn't interrupt the process. "People have capacity," she said finally, and she said it like she was explaining a universal law. "Every family has a certain amount of resources, emotional, financial, relational, and those resources are not infinite. At some point, you have to decide how to allocate them, how to keep the system stable." She said this not as a threat or an accusation, but as a fact of life, like explaining gravity or thermodynamics. And she looked at me while she said it, which meant that I was being invited to understand this truth, that I was mature enough to grasp it. "Are you saying we shouldn't help her?" I asked. "I'm saying that helping her in the way your father wants to help her, infinite support, infinite patience, infinite reassurance, might not be sustainable. And it might not actually help her. It might make her think she's more broken than she is. It might make her dependent on external validation in a way that will hurt her in the long run." This felt new and old at the same time. It felt like the tomato moment, except now the stakes had weight. Now there was a real person involved. Now I was being asked to understand something about her. "So what do we do?" I asked. "We maintain appropriate boundaries," my mother said. "We don't catastrophize. We expect her to meet basic standards of behavior. And we try very hard not to let her problems become our problems." That was 15 years ago. I need to tell you what happened between then and now, but I also need to tell you that nothing happened for a long time. That's the part that's hard to explain. That's the part where the story does not move, and yet everything moves. For the next few years, my sister spiraled in the way that teenagers sometimes do, except that the spiral didn't seem to have a bottom. It kept going. She got worse. The sleeping got worse, not just 14 hours, but sometimes 20. She would wake up and go back to sleep. She would move through the house like someone underwater. She started experimentation with drinking, not heavily, but deliberately. She found pills in my parents' medicine cabinet, old Xanax, leftover codeine, and took them without telling anyone. She ran away once for a night and came back without saying where she'd been. My father moved toward her with everything he had. He put her in therapy. He researched medications. He had long conversations with her where he tried to convince her that she mattered, that her existence had weight. My mother watched, and she slowly, consistently withdrew. Not in a cruel way, in an administrative way. She stopped asking my sister about school. She stopped attending her parent-teacher conferences, delegating that to my father. When my sister would try to talk to her, my mother would listen with a face that suggested she was listening from a great distance. She was there, but not present. She was maintaining appropriate boundaries. She was, I realize now, beginning the process of separation. I was in this too, though I didn't think of it that way. I was at an age where I had my own life, my own friends, my own trajectory. I was beginning to understand that I might want things, to go to a good college, to have a life beyond this house, to become someone distinct from my family. And my mother made it clear that my stability was worth protecting, that I shouldn't let my sister's problems derail my college plans, my social life, my future. She framed it as reasonable. She framed it as self-preservation. "You can't pour from an empty cup," she said once, which is such a reasonable thing to say. I've heard it so many times since then. It sounds like health. It sounds like wisdom. Your sister's issues are her issues, she said, which also sounds reasonable. Which sounds like teaching independence, teaching someone not to blame the world for their problems. It's not your job to save her, she said. Which is the kind of thing I think people do need to hear sometimes. But I didn't need to hear it. I didn't need permission to let my sister go. By the time I was 17, there had been a distance between Caroline and me that hadn't been there before. We lived in the same house, but we were separated by something. By silence. By my mother's framing of her as a problem. By my own sense that being near her was a kind of liability. This is the part that is hard to admit. This is the part where my complicity starts to look less like compliance and more like active participation. I was 18 when things came to a head. My sister was 15. I was preparing to move away for college. I had been accepted to a good school, competitive, far from home, the kind of place that felt like an escape. And Caroline had just finished her second attempt at what we later learned was an intentional overdose. Not huge, nothing immediately life-threatening in the way some overdoses are, but intentional. She didn't take the whole bottle. She took my parents' sleeping medication, just enough to be noticed, just enough to create a crisis. She was hospitalized. This is the part where the story starts to move, or seems to. Hospitalization, crisis, the kind of moment that usually forces things into the open. But it didn't, not the way you'd think. There was a family meeting with the hospital social worker. I remember the room. I remember the fluorescent lights making everyone look sick. I remember the social worker's careful explanations of depression, of risk factors, of the importance of family support during recovery. She kept saying, moving forward, as if forward was a direction we could just decide on, as if we were a functional family having a setback rather than what we actually were. She showed us pamphlets. She talked about neurochemistry. My father kept asking what he should do, what he could do, how he could help. He was taking notes. He wanted to understand the mechanism of his daughter's pain. And I sat there, next to my mother, physically closer to her than to my father, and I felt, I need to be accurate about this, I felt that I was being tested, that my mother was watching to see whose side I was on, whose version of reality I would accept. The social worker recommended treatment, a psychiatric hospital, a residential program, months of intensive care. She said the research was clear. Adolescents with recurring suicidal ideation needed more than outpatient support. They needed structure, supervision, professionals who could intervene when things got dark. She said it in a way that sounded optimistic, like this was a problem that could be solved. My mother listened to all of this, and then she said, very quietly, "That would be very expensive." The social worker said there were financial assistance programs. Insurance could cover most of it. There were scholarships for families with lower incomes. My mother nodded, but I could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. Not the financial calculation, the other kind. The kind where she was measuring the cost against something intangible, against the impact on the family, against the question of whether my sister was actually worth saving, or whether she was simply broken in a way that no amount of treatment could fix. When we left the hospital, I remember the way the doors opened automatically. I remember thinking about how mundane that was, that the same doors that let us walk in with a child on psychiatric hold also let us walk out into the parking lot like nothing had happened. My parents were arguing in the car in a way they usually didn't. Not loudly. My parents didn't argue loudly. But I could hear the strain in their voices. My father wanted to pursue the residential program. He said the research was there. He said we had some resources. He said we should try. My mother was more cautious. She said we should try outpatient first. She said medication could help. She said that residential programs sometimes created dependency rather than healing. She said that sometimes protecting someone from consequences prevented them from developing resilience. These are not unreasonable things to say. This is the thing about my mother that made everything so complicated. She sounded right. Even when she was wrong, she sounded right. Even when her logic was being used to justify abandonment, it sounded like wisdom. Over the next weeks, my sister came home. She was medicated. She was seeing a therapist once a week on a Tuesday afternoon at 3:30. My father tried to be present and supportive. He would drive her to appointments. He would ask her about therapy. He would make her favorite foods. My mother's presence was absence. It was a withdrawal of attention so consistent and careful that it never looked like punishment. It just looked like moving on. It just looked like accepting reality. My father would ask my sister about her day. My mother would be in another room. My father would mention that he'd heard something on the radio that made him think of her. My mother would mention how much the copays were, how much her own business had suffered from her being less focused on work, how much our family's peace had been disrupted by this ongoing situation. It's around this time, maybe 2 months after the hospitalization, that my mother started framing it differently. Not, our daughter is struggling, but our family is being pulled apart. Not, Caroline needs help, but how much help can we realistically provide? Not, what does Caroline need to recover, but what do we need in order to survive this? These reframings happened in quiet moments. My mother would be driving me to school, or we'd be cooking dinner, and she'd introduce an idea so carefully that it felt like she was just thinking out loud. Like she wasn't trying to convince me of anything. Like she was simply sharing her thoughts with someone mature enough to understand. "Your father is exhausted," she said once. "I can see it. He's putting everything into this, and I don't think it's helping Caroline. I think it might be making things worse. I think she's becoming dependent on his attention, and that's not actually love. That's enmeshment." She used that word carefully. Enmeshment. A word from therapy culture that sounded clinical, healthy, wise. I wasn't wrong. My father was exhausted. But my mother's framing of that exhaustion, as evidence that the strategy wasn't working, rather than evidence that my sister was genuinely struggling, was doing something specific. It was creating doubt. "I worry about sustainability," she said another time. "Not about being unsupportive, just your sister is going to need to learn that she can't lean on us forever, that people have limits, that if she doesn't start taking responsibility for her own recovery, all our efforts are going to be wasted. And she needs to understand that our love has conditions, or she's going to go through life expecting the world to accommodate her brokenness." This also sounds reasonable. Except that my sister was 16 years old and had recently tried to die. And the question was not whether she would eventually become independent, but whether she would survive long enough to get there. I was leaving for college. This was the backdrop to everything. I had been accepted to a good school, competitive and far away, in a different state. My mother thought this was wonderful. She would talk about my future with a kind of excitement. She believed in my potential. She had always believed in my potential. My father seemed proud, but sad. And my sister was at home, trying to survive. Not thrive. Survive. I remember visiting a friend's college 2 hours away that August, and their family seemed chaotic. Loud, everyone arguing, parents visibly stressed about money, about the oldest son's dropout, about everything, and I thought, this is what struggle looks like. This is what chaos looks like. We're not like this. We were functional, organized. We maintained stability. We didn't expose our problems to the world. We handled them quietly. We managed them. I was supposed to arrive at college in September. Before I left, my mother asked if I had time for coffee. We went to a cafe near our house, a place we'd been going since I was in middle school. It had the same waitress sometimes, and she would say, "What can I get for you two?" Like we were a unit, like we belonged together. And my mother ordered a cappuccino, black, no sugar, and I ordered my usual. And we sat in a booth by the window, and she said something like, "I want to talk about what happens next." I don't remember the exact wording of what she said, I only remember how it landed, how it felt in my chest. She was concerned, she said, about the sustainability of our current approach with Caroline. She loved my sister, she said, but she was starting to believe that the most loving thing we could do was stop enabling her dysfunction. These are words from therapy culture. They sound right, they sound like health, they sound like hard-won wisdom. What does that mean? I asked, though I think I was starting to know. I think some part of me had been expecting this conversation, waiting for my mother to say out loud the thing that had been implied for months. It means that if your sister wants to continue living at home, she needs to meet certain standards. She needs to be in school. She needs to be engaged in her recovery. She needs to show that she's taking responsibility for her own mental health. And if she's not willing to do those things, then I think we need to accept that we can't help her, that we've done what we can. She just got out of the hospital, I said. She's 16. I know, my mother said, and she sounded sad when she said it. This is the thing, she sounded genuinely sad, as if she had thought about this very carefully and arrived at this conclusion reluctantly, as if she was carrying the weight of this decision. But I think enabling her to stay in a depressive state, waiting for us to save her, is actually cruel. I think the kindest thing we can do is create circumstances where she has to take responsibility for her own recovery, where she has to understand that there are consequences to choosing depression over health. I remember my coffee getting cold while I tried to understand what she was actually saying. I remember the cup being warm in my hands, and then cool, and then cold. Are you saying... What are you saying? I asked. I'm saying that if your sister does not show meaningful improvement, if she continues to refuse school, if she continues to be passive in her recovery, if she continues to be a drain on our family's well-being, then I think we need to ask her to leave, to go live somewhere else, not because we don't love her, but because I don't believe her staying here is helping her or us. There it was. The thing. I need to be clear about something. My mother was not articulating this clearly. She was framing it as a conditional, a maybe, a last resort. But I could feel that the decision was already made, that she had already passed judgment, that she was presenting this to me not as an option being considered, but as a conclusion she had reached. And now she was inviting me to collude with it. She was inviting me to understand that this was the right thing, that love sometimes meant letting go. What would she do? I asked. I don't know, my mother said, but that's not our responsibility to solve. She's 16. Her father and I have already given her years of our energy and resources. She tried to die, I said. This is the only thing I remember saying with any firmness. And my mother set down her cappuccino cup. She hadn't drunk much of it, and it left a ring on the saucer. And she looked at me with something that might have been pity, and she said, I know, and I'm deeply sad about that. But sadness doesn't change biology. Your sister has a certain kind of brain, and I've come to accept that no amount of family love is going to be able to fix that. The best we can do is not let it destroy us in the process. I sat with that for a very long time. Long enough that the coffee became completely cold. Long enough that other people in the cafe came and went. There was a woman with a baby. There was someone on a laptop working. There was a man reading a newspaper. All of these people existing in their own lives, not knowing that something essential was happening here, in this booth. And I did not argue with her. I did not defend my sister. I did not say anything that required my mother to defend the position she had already taken. Instead, I allowed her to fill my silence with a kind of understanding. I let her believe that I agreed with her. And in that silence, I chose something, though I would not have called it a choice at the time. I was 18 years old and about to leave home. My mother was framing my sister as a problem I did not have to solve. She was positioning my own future as more important than my sister's survival. And I let her do it.
I let it happen in that cafe without one real objection. Not one. I could have said, "This is wrong." I could have said, "We can't do this." I could have said, "I won't accept this framing." Instead, I sat with my cold coffee and let my mother reshape the world into a place where my sister's removal made sense. When I left for college in September, my sister was still at home. My father was still trying. My mother was still waiting to see if Caroline would meet her conditions for continued residence. I called home occasionally. My mother would give me updates in that careful way she had. Caroline was still struggling.
She had missed too much school to return this semester. She was sleeping too much. She was not, by my mother's estimation, showing meaningful improvement. "I don't know how much longer we can sustain this," my mother would say, and the implication was clear, that there was a limit, and we were approaching it. But then there was a pause in the conversation where my mother was clearly waiting for me to respond, waiting to see if I would object, waiting to see if I would say, "You have to keep trying," or "We can't give up on her." And each time I didn't say those things, I was choosing again. I want to be precise about what happened next, because it's easy to make it sound dramatic, and it wasn't. It was bureaucratic. It was the opposite of dramatic. In October, my mother served Caroline with a notice. I use those words deliberately. It was written. It was formal. It said that if Caroline was not attending school and actively participating in her treatment by November 1st, she would need to find other living arrangements. My sister was still on her medication. She was still seeing a therapist once a week, but she wasn't back in school yet. School required energy she didn't have. School required the belief that there was a future worth attending. School required the belief that she was capable of sitting in a classroom for 6 hours without falling apart. I was in my dorm room when my mother told me about the notice. I was studying for a midterm. I had a paper due the next day. I was busy with the things that mattered to me. And my mother called me, and she said it the way you might describe a business decision. "I've given her a deadline," she said. "November 1st. Either she demonstrates that she's going to participate fully in her recovery, or she needs to leave." I asked where she would go. My mother said, "That's not our problem to solve." I asked what my father thought. My mother said, "Your father is sad, but he agrees that something has to change." I did not believe the second statement, but I did not challenge it. "Don't you think," I started, and then I stopped. I stopped because I could feel my mother's attention through the phone, waiting to see if I was going to be difficult, waiting to see if I was going to be like Caroline, fractious, emotional, a drain. "Yes?" my mother prompted. "Never mind," I said. "I have to go to class." This is the part that I need to linger on, because this is the most important and most shameful part of the story. I did not say anything. I had an objection. I could feel it, hot and certain inside my chest. I could feel it in my throat, and I did not voice it. My mother had created a world in which voicing that objection would have positioned me as unreasonable, as irrational, as like Caroline, as someone whose problems would become a burden on the family. My mother had made inaction feel like wisdom. She had made silence feel like agreement. She had made compliance feel like the only option available to me. For years, I told myself that I was only one person, that I was young, that I was far away, that it was not my responsibility to save my sister. My mother had given me permission to let her go, and I had taken that permission eagerly. But I understand now that permission is not the same as justification, that complicity is not the same as innocence, that allowing something terrible to happen because someone else decided it was necessary does not free you from the consequences of that allowance. By October, my sister had attempted one more time. Not seriously, a smaller gesture, a way of expressing that she could not meet my mother's conditions, that the deadline itself had become another thing that hurt too much to bear. She was hospitalized again, more briefly this time. The hospital wanted to keep her longer, wanted her in observation, wanted her on a more structured program, but my mother pushed for discharge. My mother said that prolonged hospitalization could be more harmful than helpful. My mother said that my sister needed to learn that she could survive difficult feelings without requiring constant intervention. These things might be true in some contexts. In this context, they were a way of managing the family narrative. In this context, they were a way of maintaining the timeline that would result in my sister leaving. I was not home. I was not there to see this happen. I was far away, in a dormitory 300 miles away, trying to focus on philosophy and introductory biology, and I was allowing my mother to make decisions about my sister's life without my voice in the room, without my objection, without me saying, "No, this is wrong." The easy thing would be to say that I didn't know what was happening, but I did know. I was choosing not to know. I was choosing to accept my mother's versions of things. I was choosing to let her authority supersede my own conscience. When my sister came home from the hospital this time, she was quieter. There was something different in her. Not better, smaller, like something had been compressed inside her. She had been told, multiple times now, that her need for help was evidence of her brokenness, that expecting support from her family meant she was a burden, that the love she needed from them was conditional on rapid improvement. She had absorbed the message. She had learned it in the way you learn things from the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally. You learn it into your bones. November came. By November 1st, my sister had not demonstrated meaningful improvement by my mother's standards. This had been, all along, a nearly impossible standard to meet. My sister was 16 years old and was trying to recover from suicidal depression while being told that her family's love was conditional on rapid improvement. My sister was trying to become a different version of herself while being given no evidence that any version of herself was acceptable. November 1st, my mother asked her to leave. I need to be clear about what actually happened, because I can tell you the facts, and they might sound less terrible than they were. Caroline did not become homeless in the way you might imagine. My mother's version of asking her to leave was that my sister went to stay with my aunt. Not a cold expulsion, but an exile couched in caring language. It was, "You need to see that you can take care of yourself." And, "Your aunt has offered to help you figure things out." And, "This is not about punishment, this is about boundaries." But what it actually was, my mother removed my sister from the home when my sister was in the most unstable period of her life. She did this with the rationale that my sister's removal would protect the family's emotional resources. She did this with the certainty that she was making the right choice. My sister lived with my aunt for 8 months. Her relationship with our parents became strained. Her relationship with me became something different, not cold, but distant. Like she was looking at me from somewhere very far away, trying to figure out if I was someone she could trust. And the answer, she seemed to have concluded, was no. I came home for spring break during those 8 months. I saw my sister once. We went to a diner near our house, the kind of place that feels like it hasn't changed since 1987. Red vinyl booths, a jukebox that still works, a waitress who has been there for decades. My sister ordered a salad. I ordered a sandwich. We sat across from each other in a booth, and I realized that I didn't know what to say to her anymore. I didn't know how to bridge the gap that my mother had created and I had allowed to be created. She was thin in a way that seemed intentional. She was on different medications. She was working part-time at a bookstore, trying to prove something to our mother about her capacity for stability, trying to meet a standard that could never actually be met. I asked her how she was doing. She said, "How do you think I'm doing?" I didn't know what to say. I had made a choice by allowing a choice to happen. I had positioned myself on the side of stability, which is to say the side of my mother. I had believed her version of things. I had accepted her logic. "I'm sorry," I said finally. She asked for what? I couldn't answer. I couldn't articulate that I was sorry for not fighting, for not doing anything, for letting my mother's logic become my logic, for believing that being reasonable was the same as being right, for choosing my own comfort over my sister's survival. "You don't have to apologize," my sister said. And then, which was somehow worse, "You have your own life." This is the moment where the story is supposed to pivot, where the narrator realizes something is very wrong and takes action, where the narrator goes home and confronts their mother and demands that things change. But that's not what happened. What happened is that I continued my life. My sister remained distant. My mother, over time, seemed to adjust to my sister's absence from the home in the way you adjust to a piece of furniture that's been removed. You stop noticing that it's gone. My father never quite adjusted. He would ask about Caroline, would try to maintain connection, but my mother kept setting boundaries around his engagement, framing it again as healthy, as protecting him from codependency, as allowing my sister to learn self-sufficiency. Years passed. My sister eventually moved back in for a period, then out again. The oscillation became the new normal. My mother would withdraw support, my sister would destabilize, my father would try to intervene. My mother would reframe intervention as enmeshment, and I, from a distance, would not push back. I finished college. I got a job. I had my own apartment, my own life that my mother had correctly identified as worth protecting, and my sister became the person I was not. This is the insidious thing about what my mother did. She was not wrong that people have limits. She was not wrong that families have resources. She was right about many of the individual things she said. What she did was construct a world in which all of those correct observations added up to the conclusion that my sister was too much, that loving her came at too high a cost, that my family's survival depended on my sister's removal. And I allowed that world to be built around me. I benefited from it. I went to college without the distraction of my sister's crisis. I had my own room, my own space, my own future that was not shadowed by concern for someone else's survival. I'm 33 now. My sister is 30. She is alive, which is not a small thing. She's working. She's in therapy. She's functional in the ways that matter most. But our relationship is something that was damaged and never quite repaired. There is a distance between us that my mother created and I enabled. I see my mother regularly. We have a good relationship. She is proud of me. She is proud of my sister too, I think, though there is always a kind of reservation in it. A belief that Caroline has managed despite her limitations, rather than a belief that Caroline has simply become a person with a complex interior life. I have never directly confronted my mother about what happened. I have never said, "What you did was wrong." I have never said, "You moved my sister out of the house and that caused damage that is still there." I have never said these things because I was complicit, because I allowed it, because I benefited from it, because in some way I am still afraid of my mother, still afraid that if I say the wrong thing, she will withdraw from me the way she withdrew from my sister. And this is what I'm living with now. Not anger, exactly. Not guilt in the way you might expect. But something more like a permanent question that I cannot answer. Something like a weight that doesn't lift. Was my mother cruel? I don't think so. Was she wrong? I'm not sure. People do have limits. Families do have resources. Depression in an adolescent is genuinely difficult. All of those things are true. But something also happened in that situation, where the correct observation of limits became an excuse for abandonment, where acceptance of boundaries became an excuse for withdrawal, where love became conditional on the person being less broken. And I was never asked explicitly to choose, but I was positioned to choose by the way my mother framed the situation, by the way she made compliance sound like wisdom, by the way she made my silence feel like agreement, by the way she ensured that objecting would have cost me something, her approval, her pride in me, her attention. For years I told myself that I was only one person, that I was young, that I was far away, that it was not my responsibility to save my sister. My mother had given me permission to let her go, and I took that permission. But I understand now that permission is not the same as justification, that complicity is not the same as innocence, that allowing something terrible to happen because someone else decided it was necessary does not free you from the consequences of that allowance. My sister barely speaks to my mother now. They see each other sometimes, at holidays, and there is a politeness between them that breaks my heart. My father has learned to accept my mother's view of healthy boundaries, and I have learned to live with the fact that I let someone I loved be sacrificed on the altar of family stability. I don't know if my sister forgives me. I don't think she does. I don't think she's angry exactly, but I think she understands, in the way you understand things about people you have known your whole life, that I chose not to fight.
That I chose to benefit from her removal. And I have tried, over the years, to do penance for this. I have tried to be a better sister. I have tried to rebuild a relationship that my mother demolished and I allowed to stay demolished. But there are some things that cannot be fully repaired. There is a breach between us that will always be there. There is a knowledge that I had the power to say no, and I didn't. I'm not here to redeem myself. I'm not going to tell you that I finally stood up to my mother, or that I had some grand confrontation that fixed everything. That didn't happen. I'm not here to tell you that I learned something and grew. I did grow, I suppose, but growth is not the same as redemption. Growth is not the same as absolution. I'm here to tell you what it feels like to be the kind of person who lets something happen. To understand, years later, that your silence was a form of violence, that your compliance was a form of betrayal, that your choice to protect yourself came at someone else's expense. My mother did not frame it as a choice about who deserved saving. She framed it as a choice about limits, about boundaries, about what was sustainable. But it was, in the end, a choice about who deserved to be kept and who deserved to be cast out. And I let her make that choice. I let her make it without me standing up and saying that the choice was not hers alone to make, that it was not my role to accept it without question. This is something I will carry. This is not something that gets resolved in the space of a story. This is not something that gets resolved at all. This is something that remains, quiet and heavy, in the knowledge that I was given a moral choice and I did not choose. Or rather, I chose. I just chose wrong. I think about my sister sometimes, and I wonder if she thinks about me. I wonder if she understands that I was also being manipulated, also being positioned, also being told that my survival depended on my compliance.
But I also understand that my youth and my distance don't excuse anything. That understanding does not absolve. That sympathy for myself does not change what I did. I carry the knowledge that I had a voice and I didn't use it, that I had power and I didn't exercise it, that I let someone I loved be sacrificed because it was easier than fighting, because fighting would have cost me something, because my mother's approval felt more important than my sister's survival. This is the confession. This is what still hasn't settled inside me. This is the weight that doesn't lift, even after all these years.